JavaScript. I anticipate that a lot of this will be familiar to you, and I hope it is. We're not going to spend too much time on every single nook and cranny, just kind of an overview of what you guys did in the pre-work. I posted a screenshot into Slack. This is from the lesson plan. These are just a little bit of the high points that we're going to walk through. I'm going to walk through this stuff, because I want to get to the control flow and get you guys to lab time. So if you do have any questions, please speak up. Otherwise, we're not going to stop on every single detail of this lesson in the interest of time. But to start, after reading that article, would someone want to come on mic and explain what is a data type? How would you explain a data type? This isn't necessarily explicit or specific to JavaScript, obviously. But how would you describe a data type in your own words? You can put it into Slack if you wish. But in regards to programming in general, how would you describe a data type? See some folks typing away, that's good. Let's see, Boolean strings and numbers. Yeah, absolutely. So those are considered data types. Yeah, for sure. Any other thoughts? Yeah, so Alan says it refers to how JavaScript stores and treats data. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's pretty important because, like, if we're trying to do arithmetic, obviously we want to use, most of the time, we'd want to use a number data type versus like a string or a Boolean data type. There may be some like outlier cases where maybe we're trying to add or subtract Booleans. I really can't think of any, but yeah. So we have a couple of other comments here. So Deb says, a definition of how you want a computer to handle a piece of information, handle as a character or Boolean or floating point number. Yeah, for sure. Christina says, Booleans are true, false, strings are words. Strings could also be like a letter, right? Like a single letter would be a string. And numbers are numbers. Very nice. Mike says the type for data determines its role. Yeah. And Alexandra, please correct me if I'm wrong. I'm so Southern and my tongue just doesn't work sometimes. Classification of data, maybe. Yeah, these are all really good descriptions. Let me put in from the lesson, which is actually also kind of borrowed from Wikipedia. It's a little wonky, but if we're getting really specific, in computer science and programming, a data type, or simply type, is a classification identifying one of the various types of data that determines the possible values for that type, the operations that can be done on values of that type, the meaning of the data, and the way values of that type can be stored. So it's a little wonky, but some languages, when you declare a variable, you must tell that variable, you must tell the programming language what data type that variable will be. So if I define a var number, I would have to tell that language, this will always be a number data type, or this other variable will always be a string data type. Luckily with JavaScript, JavaScript's a little more forgiving. We don't have to do that. We can just do var name equals mark as a string, or var name equals, 10 or whatever, or true or false. So JavaScript's very forgiving in that way. But also the data type determines what types of operations that you can perform on a given piece of data. So that's another reason that data types are really important. It works all of the time, Mark, yes. 40% of the time, it works every time. Here's a couple of data types, or primitives as they're known in JavaScript. I'm sure you've seen these, not only in JavaScript, but other languages. This is pretty much true across all languages, programming languages. It's relatively language agnostic, but most languages will have strings integers, floats, booleans. Later in the week, we'll talk more about objects, so arrays and hashes. Those are very special data type, but you pretty much can't go wrong with strings, integers, floats, and booleans. Ruby treats these a little bit different. So Ruby may have like integers, floats. What else does Ruby have? It has a couple of other more specific number data types. I'm either in Ruby world or JavaScript world, so it's escaping me at the moment. But an integer would be a whole number. A float would be a decimal point. Then a Boolean is true or false. And a Boolean, true or false, is different. I'll put this into Slack. So, and you guys are probably pretty savvy at this. So true does not equal, well, true and true. Are these two things the same? Give me a thumbs up if you think these are the same thing. Just give me a nice cheesy thumbs up in Slack. Ooh, I see some thumbs down. Yeah, that's correct. So the one on the left here, that would be a Boolean data type of true, and then the one on the right would be a string data type of true. So just little things, to be mindful of as we go through this. Yeah, exactly. So Christina, one is a string, one is a Boolean. Absolutely. Let's look at two different ways to create or to use JavaScript. This may have been in your pre-work, but one way is to create a separate JavaScript file and run it through the Node environment that you guys installed yesterday. Let's take a quick look at how we could do that. And we'll code along. I'm going to share my screen and we can kind of code along for this part. So there we go. I'm going to share my screen now, so don't be alarmed. Cool. So for this one, if you want to go into your terminal, open up a new terminal window, go ahead and CD onto your desktop. I'm just going to put this garbage on the desktop because we can dump it later just for this little demo. But go ahead and go to your desktop, and then let's just touch, we don't even have to create a directory. Let's touch a dummy file. Let's do a test.js. So touch test.js. And then go ahead and open that up in Atom. So would someone want to put into Slack? Well, it's already there in the screenshots, never mind. I was going to say, how would we open this file in Atom? I'm so bad about that. I answer my own questions. So we can do an Atom test.js to open this up in Atom. And let's put a very simple, let's just put a console log function in here. Just ignore all this other junk on my desktop. But if you open up test.js, let's just put a console log hello world. Very simple. And then save that file. So one way to run a JavaScript file directly from the terminal prompt is we can use Node, which you guys installed yesterday. So once you save that file, we can go back to the command line, and you can run Node and then give it an argument. In this case, the argument is going to be the name of the file that we want Node to process. So if you go back to the terminal prompt and run node test.js and run that, it's going to parse our file. This awesome, took us hours to write this code, this console log, and we should see a console log of the string hello world there on the command line. So that's one way that we can run a file. So obviously if we're doing something, some really elaborate pieces of code, it makes sense to put it into a separate file in some sort of text editor so we can make changes, we can add, we can delete, things like that. Now, if you don't want to use a file, you can go directly into the Node repo. We can go directly into the Node environment and we can play around with JavaScript. So if we're just doing like some smaller expressions and statements, some smaller pieces of code, it's fine to go in there and do that. It doesn't get too tricky. If what we're doing this for the next 30 minutes or so, this will be fine. So to enter the Node repo to run JavaScript, we can just type in node there from the command line prompt. And then you should see that greater than little sign, that prompt there with the blinking cursor. So we are now in a JavaScript environment where we can run and test our JavaScript. There's other environments that we'll see. Has anyone gone into the dev tools in Chrome and played around in the dev tools there in the console? So that's another valid JavaScript environment. But this is using the Node software specifically that we downloaded yesterday via Homebrew to evaluate our stuff. So give me a thumbs up if you put Node into the terminal prompt and you have Node up and running. Yeah, I see a couple of thumbs up. So when I'm sharing my screen, and you guys may have experienced this too, I can only see 4 faces at a time. So sometimes I can't see if everyone has a thumbs up there. So that's one reason that we ask you to put it into Slack sometimes. Cool, so we have 9 thumbs up, awesome. So let's run through this lesson. I just want to point out a couple of, obviously this is not an exhaustive deep dive into JavaScript, but let's just touch on some very handy things to be aware of. I know I've said this before, we'll harp on this pretty frequently, but the goal of this course is not to memorize stuff. Again, I said this morning, the only stuff that I remember in the old noggin, I've just done it so many times. So don't worry about memorizing this stuff or knowing it by heart. You can always look this stuff up. And the more you use it, obviously, the more these tools will just come to the top of your mind. The first thing I wanted to point out is a method called type of. So this is a really handy JavaScript tool. I use this a lot if I'm trying to maybe if I have a program and I'm getting user input, maybe I need a number, but the user input, when they input something into a text box or something, obviously it's going to be parsed as a string or as text. And maybe I want to make sure that I'm converting that correctly into a number or something. So maybe I want to just do a sanity check and make sure that I've converted that appropriately. And I can use this function, this method, type of. So this is a way to check a data type of a particular value. So the way this would work, if you're following along, just that first example, so you can do type of and then a number. I need to put type of there, excuse me. You can do type of 37 or type of mark, whatever, and it'll show you the data type. This also, the parentheses are kind of optional here. Make this a little larger for you guys. So there's some parentheses under the hood that we're not seeing. You could put those or not, and it should be fine. It's pretty forgiving that way. When we get to the Ruby programming languages, we don't use parentheses ever. They're really optional, but JavaScript's very, very picky with correct punctuation, semicolons, parentheses, and such. But type of actually will work either way. So that's a really great way to check the specific data type of something. We talked about numbers earlier. So numbers, there are integers and there are floats. I'll put that little screenshot into Slack, just something to be aware of. Arithmetic operators. So I always forget what's the, from middle school arithmetic, what's the pin? Yes, thank you. You guys already know what I'm talking about. Yeah, I always forget that abbreviation, but that is absolutely applicable to JavaScript. So the order of operations, JavaScript does adhere to those. I'm not going to bore you with walking through these, but obviously you can do all the arithmetic operators in JavaScript. There's also some special number operators. So JavaScript has a library called math with a capital M. And there's some really cool functionality in that library. And so when you use the math library, you want to make sure that you're doing a capital M math. We'll talk about this a little bit later on, but does anyone know why math needs to be capitalized? So if I do a lowercase m math.pow, for example, it's not going to work. So if I did math.pow 3 to the 2, I get all this garbage, right? But if I do capital math, then it would work. Why is that? We'll get into this a little bit later in the course, but does anyone know why that must be a capital?
Is it because it's like an object or a class?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so math is actually a class or an object in JavaScript that has a whole bunch of features built in, a whole bunch of methods like pow or floor or random. So when we call capital M.math, we're actually grabbing this object from JavaScript and then calling a specific method that belongs to math. Yeah, that's excellent. We'll talk a little bit more about object-oriented programming in the coming weeks, but yeah, that's absolutely why. Nice. So here's a couple of other ones. I won't go through all of these, but there's .pow, sqrt for square root, random, floor. And if you guys want to go through the documentation, it's actually a really good exercise. If you guys have, I don't know, 5-10 minutes at some point, I would just read through the documentation. That's what we do a lot as developers. A lot of our time is spent like diving the docs and just see all of the math methods that are available to you. You don't have to memorize them, but if you just, if you've seen it somewhere and maybe it's a little bit familiar, at some point you're going to need one of those and you'll be like, oh yeah, I could use, .floor, .random for this. And then you can go look up in the documentation how to implement it specifically. If we scroll down a little bit more, so here's strings. You guys are pretty savvy on strings. So strings could be a word, it could be a series of words, it could be one letter. But strings either have single or double quotes around them. Now, here's a little question / side note in here. When do we want to use double quotes versus single quotes? What would be some use cases for that? Does it even matter?
Maybe if you want to print the double quote, you put it in single quote. Maybe?
Sorry, one more time.
Let's say you want to print out or save two quotes, you will wrap that into double quotes. Maybe.
Okay, so if we wanted to literally save the quotes, we would maybe do something like this. Try to put this in here. It's kind of hard to see, but yeah. So I think Deb may be alluding to this. Did you read the docs? The truth is out there. Yeah, if you wanted to, maybe Deb was referring to like nesting, where if you want to include some sort of quotes, you would want to wrap like those inner ticks or single quotes inside of like double outer quotes. You would need to kind of alternate them and such. What would be another reason?
Better English than I did.
Oh, well, I appreciate it. No one's ever said I speak very good English. I appreciate that. What would be another use case for using double quotes versus single quotes? What if I wanted to do something like this? Is that going to work? Is that going to be a little wonky if I tried to run that in a program? And if so, why would that be a little weird?
Everything after the S would just be dropped.
Yeah, you would get kind of either like a new line or some sort of weird ASCII character. So if you want to use a quote, like a possessive or some sort of like plural or not plural but possessive or some sort of apostrophe, you need to surround that statement in double quotes. The other thing you could do is escape it with like a backslash and such, but that's really kind of a very common use case. So if you're most of the time, a single versus a double quote is not really going to matter. I personally prefer single quotes most of the time, just because it sometimes makes the code a little cleaner because it's just less stuff. However, if you are using an apostrophe, it's you're probably going to want to use double quotes for that. I like using double quotes versus like escaping the character, but either way, it's fine. Cool. The string is also an object. Every time I create a new string, I'm creating a new instance of a capital S string object. But a string has a ton of helper methods, just like, for example, the math library or the math module does. So this is a link to the MDN, Mozilla Developer Network string documentation. Again, if you have like 10 minutes, this is just go to this documentation and just kind of familiarize yourself with all of the cool, methods that you have available. Most of the time you'll only like use a handful on a day-to-day basis, but it's really good to know kind of the power of JavaScript and what all is available to you in case it comes up at some point. But an example would be the .length property for strings. I'll put this into Slack. These are some really, pretty popular common ones that you may use, like char at, character at, .replace or .uppercase, .to uppercase or .to lowercase, things like that. We'll get some more practice with some of these methods as we go through the course. String concatenation and coercion. Just hit on this real quick. So string concatenation is when you kind of marry different strings together to combine larger strings. It's kind of the idea of concatenation. But there's also something to consider called type coercion. So if I'm trying to add, let's say, a number and a string, or a string to a number, what is JavaScript going to do? How is it going to handle that situation? So that's something if you want to test that out in Node. Let's take a quick look. So let's say that I wanted to do 5 plus, got that backwards. Let me try to add a number to a letter. You guys can try this as well. Try to add a number to a string and just see what happens. So in this case, JavaScript coerced that number 5 into a string in order to add it. And if we did, let's say 5 plus 5, it kind of does the same thing. When we get to Ruby, Ruby's going to behave slightly differently. But you can see that JavaScript is going to try to coerce that number data type into a string so that it can marry the two together. Because it can't convert the string 5 to a number. It doesn't know how to do that. But it can convert the number 5 to a string. That's pretty easy for JavaScript to do. So again, just something to be aware of with string concatenation. Now, if I wanted to combine, let's say, 2 different string variables or something together, here's an example. Well, I just posted it into Slack. Let's say that I wanted to merge hello and world. Do something like this. Actually, I'm going to put a space there. So there we get a nice, neat hello world. And that's how we do it in. That's how we do it in kind of the old school JavaScript. It's still very relevant. But the new version of JavaScript, otherwise known as, I hear it called JavaScript or ES 2015 or ES6. I don't know the official nomenclature. There's like battles over that stuff, but I call it ES6 most of the time. But there's a really cool new way to do this using template strings. And this is like a really cool thing to be aware of and to maybe start implementing into your code. Because sometimes when we try to concatenate strings like this, it can get a little burdensome. And occasionally you may even hit a situation where you have to, let's say that you're combining variables. So maybe you even have to like put an empty space in between. Like if these were 2 variables instead of literal strings, you'd have to like, that's a lot of typing. That's like 2 pluses, then this goofy just empty 1 space so that you have that spacing. That can get really cumbersome. But with the new ES6 syntax, there's something called template strings. And it looks a little something like this. So for example, let's create a, and you can follow along if you want. We'll do a var first word equals hello. And then like a var second word equals world. And then to combine these with template strings, what you want to do is use the backtick character. So the backtick character is that key to the left of the 1 up kind of at the top of the keyboard. So you can do a backtick, and then using this $ bracket or a curly brace syntax, you can literally just put a space there and concatenate these variables like such, like that. This is actually borrowed a little bit from the Ruby world, because Ruby has had this since the beginning of the language, this idea that you can concatenate strings in this way. And with the newer version of JavaScript, they kind of borrowed that, the spirit of that. And so now you can use the backtick with the $ and the curly brace to concatenate variables. And it's much, much simpler than using this right here that I just highlighted. Well, let's see it the other way. So you would have to do first word the old school way, plus a space, plus second word like so. And that's just, ain't nobody got time for that, you know? So that's a really low-hanging piece of fruit that you can start to incorporate using the new ES6 syntax if you wish. Any questions so far about what we've kind of walked through, just hitting these data types? Cool. Let's rock through these and get to some control flow. Let me just paste this next section in there, just quickly talk about it. So what happens if we add a string to a number? I talked about this a little bit, and feel free, I'm not going to do this example, but feel free to do this there locally if you wish. But there's something called implicit coercion and explicit coercion. So if you're looking at the screenshot right here, there's var b. So this would be an implicit coercion. So we're letting JavaScript like do this conversion for us based on the data type of these variables. But if we wanted to like explicitly tell JavaScript that you wanted to convert something to a string, for example, you could use this string method, and essentially you're kind of forcing JavaScript to coerce a number, in this case 42, in our var a, making JavaScript coerce it into a string. This isn't really, I rarely see this. You know, normally you would do something like this and just let JavaScript handle the coercion, but just to let you know that there's like an implicit and kind of explicit way to coerce data types, just for FYI. This is a really handy one right here. This is probably in your fundamentals pre-work, but parse int and parse float. So these are really, really handy methods to, if you want to parse an integer, like turn a string into an integer, you could use parse int. So in this example, just passing in a string of 1, 2, 3, and it'll parse it into an integer. You could also do it parse float. So if you want it to be more of a decimal data type, you could pass in the decimal and then parse it. There's also parse string, where you could parse a number into a string as well. And this is a cool thing right here, actually. I rarely use this one, but this is super handy. You could also use this unary operator. So we're going to look at unary operators, binary operators, and actually some trinary operators. But you could just do a plus sign with a string, and Node or JavaScript will go ahead and convert that, which is pretty sweet. So you do something like that, it'll convert it. That's a really handy one. I need to start like using that one more frequently. That's really slick. So just FYI. Not a number, so just something to be aware of. There's a special value called NaN. I'll put this into Slack for you. You'll see this not infrequently. So a special value called NaN, or not a number, is returned if the string is non-numeric. So if you try to coerce a string into a number, but it's not really a number string data type, or it's not really a number, you're going to get that error. So in this example, we're trying to parse int some alphanumeric characters and like a number, 1990, which is a number. And so you're going to get not a number, because JavaScript doesn't know what to do with colin. It does know what to do with 1990, but it doesn't know what to do with this entire expression. So you would get not a number. This example, since the number is actually first in the string that you're passing in, it'll just return 1990 and then just dump off the rest of the alphanumeric characters. So just FYI. You can also ask, there's a method isNaN. So similar to type of, where it would return the data type, you can also ask JavaScript, hey, is this variable not a number or not? So sometimes that's helpful when you're doing like some type checking or some debugging. So this is NaN with parentheses is sometimes helpful. Just something to be aware of. You don't have to like memorize that for sure. Null and undefined. These are two really important ones. We're going to talk more about this on Thursday when we hop into functions and scope. But JavaScript distinguishes between null and undefined. So null is a value that indicates a deliberate non-value. So null is not 0. Null is a very purposeful, deliberate non-value. Undefined indicates an uninitialized value. That is a value that hasn't even been assigned yet. Undefined is super, super common. Occasionally in your code, maybe you'll define a variable like var name, but you'll never assign anything to that variable. This happens quite frequently in large pieces of code. You just kind of space or never get around to it or whatever. So you're going to see undefined a lot. That's a very, very common error. And so when that occurs, just read the call stack. And it's usually because you declared something, you declared a variable, but you didn't actually like assign it to anything. So that's a really, really good one to keep in mind. Variables, you guys should be pretty savvy at this. So JavaScript uses the var keyword to declare a variable. Very important. When we get to Ruby, for example, Ruby does not require var keywords. Ruby doesn't require a lot of stuff, which is pretty cool. But in JavaScript, we always need to use that var keyword to declare new variables. It's very important. It does not like it if we don't use that var keyword. I'll paste this into Slack because there's also a question right down here at the bottom that I want to ask you guys. So in these examples, if you take notice, for example, this var my number equals 1. So notice that mi is lowercase, my is lowercase, and the number is capitalized. What do we call that type of syntax? Where we have like some lowercase and some uppercase.
Camel case.
Yeah, camel case. So the one important thing to keep in mind with JavaScript is that it uses camel case. That's the convention that we use with JavaScript. Ruby, for example, uses snake case. So it uses all lowercase, but it uses those underscores in between the words if it's a multi-word file name or variable name. But JavaScript, we want to make sure that we adhere to the convention of using camel case. Very important. Cool. Assignment operators. Let's paste this into Slack. We are scooting along, making pretty good time. I want to get you guys to some actual some exercises here. So assignment operators, so using the equal sign is obviously how we assign a value to a variable. There's also plus equals and minus equals. So this is a really handy shorthand of incrementing by 1 or decrementing by 1. So that's a really nice thing to use. You can also use, as it says here in the screenshot, you can also use plus plus and minus minus to increment and decrement. But if you want to reassign something, you know, decrease by 1 and reassign it, or increase by 1 and reassign it, you can use the plus equals or the minus equals. Something like that. Those are super handy. Now, if you want to turn a number into a string, we looked at how we could turn strings into numbers earlier, but if you want to turn a number into a string, it's a little different. So you actually attach this method .toString after the thing that you're trying to coerce into a string. It's a little reverse from like parse int that we saw earlier. But if you want to convert something to a string, this is how you would do it. So you would pass in the number or the float or what have you into parentheses and then do a .toString after it. And you need to make sure that you put in the parentheses after toString, which means you're invoking the function. If you try to run that method without the parentheses, it's actually going to blow up on you. Actually, well, let's take a look at that. So if I wanted to convert the number 1 to a string, let's try to do it like that. So we'll talk about this again on Thursday, but there's a difference between declaring and invoking a function. So when I call toString, when I'm trying to convert number 1 to a string, and I use the toString method without the parentheses, it's just going to say, hey, dude, so yeah, you tried to call toString, and it's a function called toString. generally, if you're doing this in like the console or in some other environment, it'll literally like show you the contents of that toString method. And if you go to the documentation and look up toString, there's actually, you know, a lot of stuff going on underneath the hood. So if I actually want to invoke this toString function, I just need to make sure to put those parentheses after it. So there's a difference between like recalling the function to see the innards or what's under the hood and invoking, actually using the function. So that's a really important thing. This is also a common error just to kind of keep in your noggins. Occasionally if something's blowing up or it's not working and you're like, but I'm calling the function, sometimes just omitting those parentheses is going to blow up your code, because if you want to actually invoke the function, you need to put the parens. So something else just to tuck away. So that's about it for like a quick run through of the data types before we get to control flow. Obviously this isn't like a super deep dive. Most of that's going to come with, you know, the actual hands-on practice. But any questions on a high level about JavaScript data types, running a script from the console? How do we run a script from the console? So if I'm going to create a WDI rules script, WDI.js script, if you want to put it into Slack, how would I run that file using JavaScript? So I have a WDI, yeah, exactly. Well, technically it's supposed to be WDI rules, but I guess WDI is cool. Yeah, so node and then the argument, which would be the file name after it. So Mike asks, when would you use string versus toString? So let's see. So Mike, you mean something like that? It's pretty much up to you. If you're trying to convert maybe a variable name or something, you may want to use string and then in parentheses. Or if you're trying to construct a new string from scratch, this is more of a constructor type situation where I'm trying to create a brand new string from scratch. If something already exists, I mean, obviously, we could just type in something. But let's say that you have a variable that already contains a number, and you wanted to convert that to a string. I would probably rely on the .toString method. That's much more common. As I mentioned earlier, I think we looked at that string example at the beginning. I was just showing you guys this explicit coercion. This certainly exists, and sometimes you'll see it, but kind of the better way is to use more of an implicit coercion, or to use just a method like that. Yeah, so one of the screenshots I posted earlier, yeah, if we scroll up, that was just kind of demonstrating the difference between implicit coercion, where JavaScript is just gonna like see the data types and figure it out, versus explicitly saying, hey, convert this variable into a string, this variable A. So this is a little bit of a different pattern than down here, because here we're actually converting a variable to a string, right? The variable just happens to contain a number, but we're technically converting a variable. This is a little less code actually. Like, just let me pop a toString on there, and that's like saving 2 lines of code or something. But yeah, I would, just to let you know, there's implicit and explicit coercion, but 9 times out of 10, I would just use the toString. That's much more common. Cool. Let's take, if there are any, are there any more questions about anything we covered? Okay, cool. Take a 5-minute break. Let me get the next lesson loaded up, and we'll move on with control flow. And then we're going to get you guys going on a lab by 4:30 or sooner. I'm going to put you into breakout rooms with your buddy, and you guys can hack away. So let's come back at 3:31 p.m. Eastern, and we will move forward.